Yeah, which is what I was saying about Roland Emmerich. He just puts these little historical facts all over the place,
without realizing their significance or context.
or at least making the audience aware of the significance.
Hi, I'm Vernon and this is Kit, and we just watched Midway. Kit, what did we just watch?
We watched a rather earnest depiction of the World War II naval battle, a mix of historical, documentary, and personal drama.
The Battle of Midway is a very short chapter and small confrontation in the much larger war in the Pacific in the Second World War. So there are a lot of takes, possible ways to tell this story. How does Roland Emmerich approach the Battle of Midway as a film, as a story to tell?
Roland Emmerich took a rather conventional approach, which is a good approach. You see it in a lot of war movies, but also specifically in the 1970s Charlton Heston movie, also called Midway, also about the battle. And what they do is it's just a combination of showing you the overall strategic situation, especially as seen through the eyes of the commanders, the admirals.
On both sides of the engagement, both the Americans and Japanese.
But you also want to look at the close-in action, so you also highlight a few of the soldiers on the ground or the pilots in the aircraft.
So Roland Emmerich allows the audience to see the action through the eyes of a dive bomber.
Pilot played by Ed Skrein, who was last seen as the bad guy android in Alita Battle Angel.
He was also one of the original Darios in Game of Thrones.
Really?
Yes, he was he was a Dario with the extremely long hair, and who got replaced after one season. So basically, the emphasis is like Top Gun. Ed Skrein plays a Tom Cruise-esque dive bomber pilot with a huge ego, a very quarrelsome man, very arrogant man, but a man who is really good at what he does.
And very brave.
But is disliked by everyone, of course.
I think Ed Skrein might have been the best thing about the movie, because one thing is that Roland Emmerich didn't really choose a real focus for the whole movie, so it's all over the place. So for the Americans, Midway is seen as a turning point in the war. That's like their first major naval victory over the Japanese. Before that, the Japanese looked like invincible. This is a 2.5-hour movie, and they spend the first hour setting the historical scene for the battle. So they do show
Pearl Harbor.
They show the attack on the Marshall Islands. They show the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was just before the Battle of Midway.
But they even start off several years before the war in the late 1930s in Japan. And in fact, the movie starts way out in the late 1930s, where the US intelligence officer Edwin Layton meets the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto.
But there's just a very short prologue. So
it's a very weird prologue, if you don't mind me saying so. It is kind of plays out a lot of threads and themes that aren't actually followed through in the rest of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense if it later played out as like a competition between Layton and Yamamoto. The commonality is like both of them worked as naval attaches or assistant naval attaches before.
And both of them gave very good advice about the potential enemy, but the advice was ignored for quite some time until the war actually started.
The Americans like Yamamoto because he respected them. He's famous for saying that after Pearl Harbor, they awakened the sleeping giant, and that he predicted that Japan would lose the war if it carried on for more than 1 year.
And in fact, both his predictions do make it into the dialogue in this movie.
Roland Emmerich didn't really have a theme or focus for the whole movie. It was just like, okay, he would just grab historical facts that did happen, but he didn't pitch it as this miracle. Because some people call it the miracle at Midway. He didn't pitch it as
revenge movie. It's not a revenge movie. It's not a strategy movie.
So in terms of a revenge, the Americans really did feel the need for revenge. So like after Pearl Harbor, the American admirals, unofficially amongst themselves, swore to sink every single Japanese carrier that attacked Pearl Harbor. And before the end of the war, they actually did. But this also was not the highlighted by Roland Emmerich.
And in fact, this very interesting and very relevant nugget was not even in the movie. In fact, the movie kind of plays up the supposed rivalry, at least in the American side, between the Washington and the naval intelligence. One side believed that the Japanese were planning to attack Midway, and the other side thought the Japanese were going to attack somewhere else.
But it was resolved quite cleanly, and it was shown in the movie, but it's slightly different from the accounts that I've read. The accounts I've read was that they purposely staged signaling out in clear text that Midway had a problem with its freshwater distiller, just to find out what the Japanese code of AF meant. Whereas in this movie, it's shown that this was done accidentally. So I'm not sure. Historically, a lot of the things here don't seem to line up with what I've read. But then I haven't been following for like the past 20 years.
Military history could have been rewritten since then, but I think they've had several decades to rewrite it or to correct it.
At the end of the movie, they said that the intelligence guy, Leighton, he wrote his memoirs about Midway only in 1985. And it was only then that the public knew what a major role the code breaking had in winning the battle. But it's not just him. I think the code breaking stuff was classified for decades, as were a lot of the American submarine operations, because they were so effective. I think up until at least the 1970s, a lot of this information was classified. But I think my biggest gripe about the historical accuracy in this movie is that they totally sidelined Admiral Spruance, which I think is the real hero in this movie.
Now, in this movie, Admiral Spruance was he
was in charge of the carriers. He was actually the battlefield commander. Spruance was in charge of the carrier air wings of the three, either two of the three carriers or all three carriers. But in this movie, they made it look like Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific, back in Pearl Harbor, was making all the calls, like when to attack and when to withdraw. Because they were waiting for intelligence from their spotter planes about the location of the Japanese fleet. And the decision that Spruance made was that they would launch at extreme range, which was quite a cold-blooded decision, because even though, let's say, you know that your theoretical range of your aircraft is 200 miles, but if you actually launch them at 200 miles,
they won't have enough fuel to make it back.
Not all will, maybe 90% will, assuming that there's no battle damage. But if there's battle damage, if they've got a hole in their fuel tank, if there's any kind of issue.
A long engagement, a long sortie, for example, they run out of fuel.
Yeah. So, but if you launch too late, if you're too nice to your air crew and wait until you're safe, you launch too late, there's a chance that the Japanese will have launched first and hit your carriers. So Spruance made this really gutsy but very, very cold-blooded decision, which most historians say is the correct decision. And he replaced Admiral Bull Halsey, who is more famous. And Halsey is famous for being a lot more aggressive. And after Spruance hit the Japanese carriers, he withdrew for the night because he was afraid of the Japanese battleships that were surviving.
But in this movie, it's shown that he was given orders to withdraw
From Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away, which is ridiculous. And but that's the kind of really cool head that Spruance had. Halsey would have gone after the Japanese battleships and might have gotten into trouble then. So Spruance really did a good job, and that was not shown at all in this movie. And not only that, at the end of the movie, they have these like brief summaries of what happened to these major characters afterwards.
At least to their military careers, but Spruance surprisingly doesn't get a summary at all. Even Halsey
gets a mention, even though he sat out the whole battle. So it's like, what the hell? From a historical viewpoint, I think this movie is not very successful. The 1970s movie actually seems more accurate to me, and also they explain the battle better, even though of course the special effects weren't as good, and you could see sometimes they spliced in actual World War II footage.
War documentary footage, because the Second World War was one of the first world wars in which there were kind of embedded journalists or embedded filmmakers on all sides of the battle.
So I remember quite clearly there's a shot near the end of an American airplane landing on the carrier but then crashing, and then it breaks into two parts, and it's very clear that this is actual World War II footage because it's grainier and the color tone is also different. Okay, another nitpick here, most of the damage to the battleships at Pearl Harbor was done by torpedoes launched from the Japanese aircraft. Whereas in this movie, they show zero torpedo launches. They just showed the Japanese aircraft dropping bombs and strafing with machine guns. So it's like, why wouldn't you show the actual thing, right? Because okay, this is a really deep background, but the Japanese had a huge advantage at the start of the war because their torpedo, the long lance, was superior to the American torpedoes, both in range and in lethality, in the size of the warhead, but also in reliability. And which is slightly touched upon in this movie. They do show, like in the Marshall's battle,
an American torpedo failing to detonate.
That is true. But they didn't really expound on this much in the movie.
Yeah, the point is lost because we were never shown Japanese torpedoes at all.
There was a mention. There was a short mention later on saying that they're going to depend more on the dive bombers because they don't trust their torpedoes. But that's like 10 seconds, and if you're not a military guy, a history guy, I think you would not have noticed that part. Did you notice the part?
I thought it was a very arbitrary decision, but
Okay.
now that you've explained it to me, I can see the strategy behind it.
Yeah, which is what I was saying about Roland Emmerich. He just puts these little historical facts all over the place,
Without realizing their significance or context.
or at least making the audience aware of the significance. But in terms of look and feel, I think Roland Emmerich borrowed a lot from Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor.
Without Michael Bay's editing, but
Without his flair.
without his flair, but the color grading, the compositions.
He tried, but it failed. Unfortunately, the battle sequences really left me a bit cold. I didn't feel the sense of danger or urgency of drama. I don't know why. I mean, they look good, but I just
They
didn't feel
look
it.
extremely good because you've got the camera following the dive bombers as they go vertically down, and even the really epic dive bomb run by Ed Skrein at the so-called the finale of the movie. It lasts 3 minutes.
Oh, that was okay, but
But it cuts away at all the moments where you would expect the camera to linger on, I think.
my argument against it is it wasn't a dive bomb attack because he leveled out his plane at the last minute, flew level over the flight deck, and then released his bomb. That's not a dive bomb. That's a level bomb.
Yeah, historically, did they actually do that in the battle, or was this
No.
an invention?
No.
It looked like a really epic movie invention. I'll put it that way.
I think it's an invention. There's no reason to do that. It's very dangerous. You would actually release your bomb while the bomb was in a dive with your airplane, because it's more accurate. Why would you pull out into a level flight and then drop your bomb? It's actually less accurate. Because if you're level bombing, if your plane is going horizontal and bombing, the bomb also has a horizontal speed component. So when it drops, the bomb will keep on traveling horizontally. So you're not really sure where it's going to drop. It's less accurate. So, but I'm speaking more as a military buff, and I've read at least 3 books on the battle, but that was like 20 years ago. So I'm actually curious, how does Vernon see this movie without all this baggage of technical knowledge?
I found it to be more or less a standard war movie that tends to tell too many stories at one time, even in a single movie. You had way too many things going on, way too many characters, way too many threads going on, that some of the threads get kind of missing after a while. Well, like we mentioned before, there was this sort of potential cat and mouse interaction that was hinted at the very beginning of the movie in its 1930s prelude between Leighton and Yamamoto, which never really went anywhere. There was this mention about tensions between the Japanese army and the Japanese navy. There was a huge argument. There was some tensions and a catty meeting, strategy war room meeting between the heads of the army and navy in Tokyo, and then suddenly it disappeared, and the Battle of the Coral Sea and Marshall Islands got underway. So it's kind of weird. What kind of tensions did the Japanese army and Japanese navy really have? If you're not a military buff, you probably never know why there were tensions, or why even Roland Emmerich thought it would be nice to put in 1 or 2 lines about the tensions and then leave it completely unresolved. Yeah, from a story point of view, I found the character of Leighton to be really confusing. He's supposed to be the intelligence guy. He's supposed to have given advice, very good strategic advice to the Americans on how to prepare for a war against Japan, which no one in Washington took seriously. But for this particular movie, the duration of this movie, what we see on screen is Leighton being basically a glorified messenger boy for the actual intelligence workers.
The code breakers.
For the code breakers.
Rochefort, which is actually what most accounts and most movies show. They actually concentrate more on the code breakers and not on this intelligence guy.
Yeah, this intelligence guy seemed to be just, the guy ferrying messages between Rochefort and Nimitz.
The middle manager.
Played by Woody Harrelson. The other threads that were complicating the movie, I thought, was the Ed Skrine's movie wife. I mean, it's typical in war movies or military movies that every good soldier has a wife, and And then, usually the wife is there to give moral support, to stand patriotically while the husband is fighting elsewhere, and then the camera cuts back to the actual action. But in this movie, she's given some really good lines about how great and supportive and ambitious a wife she is, and then she does nothing else.
She's ambitious for her husband.
Yeah, she's ambitious for her husband, but the threads that were introduced with the character, with her character, such as career ambitions, they're kind of like not really there, because the Battle of Midway is about the Battle of Midway. It's not about people deciding who to upvote for the next job appraisal meeting.
No, that was more character development for Ed Skrein, to show that he's been passed over because of his character. It's not really about her. But they do show like the wives being fearful for their husbands when they learn about the battle. But you don't feel the sense of fear so much, of jeopardy so much, compared to movies such as Apollo 11.
Yeah, there you could really see Neil Armstrong's wife really worry for him. Here it's like they
go through the motions.
Yes, there's something about an autopilot sense that really gets to me while watching some of the scenes in this movie. It's not just the domestic scenes. For example, the whole Japanese Navy versus Army thing felt throwaway.
Well, I think that was kind of hard to do properly, because historically that was the correct setup for the battle, and there was no other use for it after that.
Yeah, it was a correct setup, but there were no consequences. There were no effects on actual decisions or actions taken, for example. So, as I say in screenwriting, if you show it, it's got to have some impact.
So overall, the movie was engaging to me, but a bit of a letdown, because I'm a big military history fan, and specifically World War II. But I'm also a big Roland Emmerich fan, because he's very good at pacing.
He tends to be very good at pacing, but this movie I was very confused, actually.
And he's also very good at putting the human element into large epic stories, but somehow he failed here.
Because I remember in 2012, even some of the characters who had very short screen time actually managed to get audience empathy, like Chin Han's engineer.
Well, the big winner in this movie would be Ed Skrein. Did a fantastic job. You really empathize with him.
And Luke Evans, who plays the captain of the torpedo bombers.
It's an okay movie. If you're not a history buff, you won't notice the flaws. But really, they screwed over Admiral Spruance here. That's unforgivable.
Yeah, I mean, compared to other war movies, how would you rate this?
Saving Private Ryan, wow, I mean, the emotional impact of like even small battle scenes. Like, I still remember the German machine gunner begging for his life. And then later on, the hand-to-hand combat, and the German like really killed the American with the bayonet. That was like, you really felt the horror there. This one was like really clean. You don't feel much. Or even in Fury, the Brad Pitt movie about American tanks in France in 1944. That had some really gut-wrenching scenes too, even though, technically it's flawed. This movie, you're like just an observer, you just watch it like, yeah, okay.
I mean, this is entertaining but confusing for me. As someone who wants to watch a movie for its story and its payoffs and its build-ups, the way this movie is told, although in a chronological order, seems to have its emphasis slightly skewed in ways that threw me off and made me very confused at times.
I don't like to be that guy, but the 1970s Charlton Heston movie is better. And that's all we got.
And we'll see you next week.
Bye.